and welcome everybody. My name is Richard Hawes. I'm product marketing for DevOps capabilities at ServiceNow. And we're going to take you through a session we're calling Reduce Configuration Related Outages with a new product or a new component of ITSM Pro called DevOps Config. So with that, let me hand you over to Joe and he can introduce himself and get us started. Over to you, Joe.
Thank you. Thanks, Richard. So Joe Offenberg here. I've been with ServiceNow about 2 years. I'm a principal outbound product manager in the DevOps BU. And I actually came over with the acquisition of a small company called Sweegle back in July of 2020. And Sweegle had a DevOps config data management platform specifically for DevOps pipelines, right? So, we will cover this today, but that technology has now been re-platformed into ServiceNow, and it's being released as part of the Tokyo release. And it's available now for download in the ServiceNow store, and you can install it. So that's what we'll be covering today. Yeah.
And just before you get going, and then Joe, I just remind people or let people know, feel free to put in questions anytime in the Q&A panel, and we'll get to those as we can throughout the call. Feel free to add comments to the chat too. We'd love to hear your experiences as we go through this.
All right. So before we go any further, we have to start with the safe harbor notice, of course. We might be making some forward-looking statements and some optimistic statements in some cases, and we need to show you this slide. Done. Okay. Also, we have these, a series of these webinars based on the capabilities of ITSM Pro. So you can, scan the link there and learn more about the other webinars that are going on also to support these new capabilities. Okay. Few housekeeping notes. Please keep yourself on mute. If you do have questions, use the chat, right? We will have time for Q&A afterward, but we're not a huge amount of attendees here, so feel free to ask questions in the chat, and Richard, who will be standing by, he could help with some of the answers, or maybe we'll jump in and answer those in real time. This will be recorded and will be made available to the ServiceNow community, and there's a short survey at the end, so we really appreciate your feedback after the webinar is over. Okay, so I'll start talking about just, what is the scope of the solution? What does config data mean? What are we talking about here? As we've transitioned to the world of DevOps, right? One of the first things ServiceNow did was create a solution for managing DevOps changes. And DevOps is about small incremental changes happening continuously. So we had to augment the change management process to support that. And that maybe you saw a previous webinar, we covered that in DevOps change velocity. That's the product there. But a big part of these DevOps pipelines also include configuration data. And what this means is you might be provisioning environments in the pipeline, and those environments might be provisioned with tools like CloudFormation at AWS or Terraform or Kubernetes. And the configuration of like application components can become very complex, especially when you realize that the same component will actually be used over and over and over again with slightly different settings and with a lot more complexity, right? So what we've done is originally with the Sweegle technology, and then now that it's been replatformed into ServiceNow, is we created a way to manage this complexity, to organize the data in a friendlier way, and then to also provide some validation around that. But first, what is the scope of this? What is the scope of this data, right? So it includes application data, often in, let's say, microservices or other types of applications. You have, feature toggles, connection strings, and so forth that are specific to the application itself. It may be in like an application properties file or config.xml file. These are just some examples, but that's an example of application config data. From one release to the next, you might have different types of dependencies on other components. So you're going to have release-related config data. Often this might be in a Maven file or a pom.xml file, some Java files that basically dictate what files go hand in hand with other files in the solution. And this is extremely valuable to be able to track this because it can change from one release to the next. And if you don't have an understanding of which releases of which applications go with which other releases of other applications, you can create some problems. And these are essentially config data problems, right? Now, as applications and move through the environments, you'll get environment changes that require different settings. So maybe in development, we know that developers like debug turned on, but we also know that in production, debug creates a performance issue. So we turn it off, right? So, but that's an environment specific setting. You want it on in development, but off in debug. Of course, you're going to connect to different databases in development, right? So the connection streams from the database to, from the application to the database is going to be different. You're going to have maybe certificates will be turned off in development, right? Where you don't have to invalidate certificates when you make connections between your microservices. Very common for developers to turn that off because it's difficult for developers to get valid certificates sometimes. So they turn off certificate validation. So these are the kind of things that are environmentally specific. And then when we look at really the total swath of data that we have, most of the data is actually infrastructure data. These are the sizing of cloud resources. This could be the shared storage, the network devices, maybe network as code devices. This could be load balancers and so on, and all of those cloud resources will have their own configuration settings. They're in YAML files, they're in JSON files, they're in INI files, property files. All of that data makes up the service, the business service you're providing, right? Especially if you're doing it in the cloud and especially if you're doing it as code. Now, what we also recognize is that this is becoming more and more of a problem. It's becoming more and more complex. We have some applications, one application could have 40,000 what we call config data items. These are the actual key value pairs. Some are like the bigger applications, like an e-commerce platform, might have 250,000 different config data items. So these are actual settings in that application. And then, of course, like a financial trading system could have over 1 million configured data items that we have to keep track of. And what happens is with the proliferation of things like infrastructure as code and tools like Terraform and Kubernetes, it becomes very easy to make these changes and redeploy the environment over and over and over again with slightly different settings. So how do you know which settings work the best? How do you know how far you're deviating from your baseline? All of that needs to be tracked. So we see this as 4 different states of configuration data, right? So first, there's the definition. A lot of this data now is declarative. You declare what you want the environment to look like. So you have a definition of what that environment should look like. Now, after you deploy it, right, you might have slightly different settings. So the definition could be based on a number of things that actually get resolved in the environment it's in. So you might have variables that get picked up in the environment that it's in. So the deployed settings might be an iteration of the definition, right? An instance of the definition. So you have to record the deployed settings. You also might have the discovered settings. So maybe after it's running for a couple of weeks, the settings change. And you need to be able to track that. An iteration of what was it 2 weeks ago as it is compared to now. Extremely valuable to be able to track that over time, because sometimes things deviate and it's a bad thing, but sometimes deviations is just normal operations. As best practices evolve, those deviations need to be recorded back into the baseline. They need to become the best practice in some situations. So you need to be able to track those deviations. And then, of course, over time, you're going to have, multiple sets of what we call snapshots. This is the history. You need to be able to track this over time. And this is, one of the capabilities of DevOps Config. And we'll go into that in detail. So first, I'm going to explain how it works. Right? So we basically get the configuration settings from the source. And typically today in a modern application, these settings sit in Git repos. or GitHub. And how do we get it? Well, when you have a pipeline that deploys the application, we could augment that pipeline, right? We can add additional commands to the pipeline to say, hey, let's take the configuration settings as they've been declared and upload that to ServiceNow and create a snapshot, right? And when we do that, we actually create in an automated way a data model. And the data model can be organized in such a way that it's business application specific. It rolls up to a business application in the CMDB. So we know that, specific types of config settings can, as they change, we can understand what business applications are impacted and so on and so forth. So all the value you get out of the CMDB can now be basically analyzed at a very low level. When I say low level, I mean the actual key value pairs that make up a config setting can roll up to that business service, okay? Once it's in the CMDB, we could provide various levels of versioning, snapshotting, and as well as access control at a granular level, a lot more granular than you would get in just a Git repo, right? So the data is now sitting in the ServiceNow, what we call the config data model, and we can lock down, we can encrypt it, we can encrypt maybe specific key value pairs, if it's a password or a certificate key or something like that. We'd want to be able to encrypt it at rest, so we have that capability as well. So as we start building up, snapshots of all this, we also have a validation engine, a rules engine that says, hey, these settings in this environment are either valid or they're not. It's pass or fail. So what that means is if you do have a config setting in development, like let's say you leave debug turned on in development, but you forget to turn it off when you check it into Git, and now we're going to promote it to production, we'll catch that in the pipeline, right? We know that debug should not be turned on in production. We know that specific, the passwords need to be encrypted in production. We know that in development, the connection strings need to be different between all the different environments. So these are the type of validation rules we can implement to make sure that these settings, as they move through the DevOps pipelines, are actually valid. Okay, so validation is something we're doing continuously for every single pipeline run. And it's also a way to take snapshots. So as the pipeline runs, if everything looks good, we'll take a snapshot. And now that snapshot becomes an immutable record of what was actually deployed in a specific environment, right? Now, once the data is available inside the platform, you could also consume it by various provisioning tools, right? What that means is you might import the data from Ansible or from Chef or Puppet, and then you can then use the same settings in a Terraform template. You can export the data in whatever format you might need to consume it. So we normalize the data in the platform, and then we have an engine that you can use to generate config files, to actually generate config files in real time for the application, for the environment, and for the correct place you're going to deploy it. Okay, so it's a very flexible and powerful platform in that regard. The other aspect of this is root cause analysis. Okay, being able to understand changes and snapshotting of changes now gives us direct links into ServiceNow, for example, incident management. I'm going to show you in the demonstration how we integrate with the service operations workspace, for example, for an alert and troubleshooting an alert. And also GRC, governance, risk, and compliance. We can actually become the control point for a GRC control, right? So we can actually be the enforcer of that control point, meaning if the control point says you have to have domains that are within a certain range, or if you're sending emails to specific domains for your messaging, we can then make sure those domains match with what the policy is, right? So that's just an example, and we'll go into that in detail. So what I'm going to do is go through a demonstration where we process incoming data from a pipeline. We apply policy to it. We validate it continuously. So as pipelines run, we're making sure it's always valid. We're taking snapshots of it, and then we're exporting it for consumption. So that's what you're going to see in the demo, but I'm also going to show you the integration with Service Operations Workspace, as well as the governance, risk, and compliance. How are we doing, Richard? Anything in the chat? Any questions?
Not so far, Joe. No.
Okay, great. Let's maybe let's start with a poll, and we can see just to understand today what folks are doing to manage their centralized config changes. Yeah.
Yeah, we want to get an idea if people are doing something today to help control the way people are making configuration changes or keep track of the way people are doing that. It's pretty simple here. A lot of people using Git for this kind of thing, or some other kind of manual tracking. Obviously, a lot of things happening in tools that are out there already. Network system tools have their own tracking tools as well. But interesting what you have there. So, and feel free to add anything into the comments if you can, if there are other things that we're not covering here that you want to mention as well. So, and it's given another few seconds for a few more answers. And a couple more.
Now,
Okay.
Richard, you can hear me okay. I see one of the comments.
Yes. Yeah. I think one person had some trouble, but I think in general, we're good for audio.
I could do the first 15 minutes over if that were the case.
Right. Yeah.
Would it be the first time? Okay.
All right. So, okay, we've got some good responses in the poll. I think we can. I'm not sure. It displays once we end the poll, right, Joe?
I believe that's
to end
great.
it.
So go ahead and click on end.
If you want to end it, then okay.
Okay. So now the poll results should be displayed. So it seems like, as I was saying, a lot of folks are using Git repos for their configuration settings. A big, and this is what we understand to be the case, and it's been like this for a few years now. And what I'll show you in the demonstration is that's okay. You can keep on using Git repos, but in a passive way, we can start collecting the data we need from those Git repos. Yeah. And
you want to say a bit more, Joe, about why we think we do things a little better than, like you said, we can continue to use Git repos, but I think there are like security considerations and access considerations and things like that that are challenging in a Git.
Yeah, space. I mean, one of the things I think, so Git, it's kind of an all or nothing access control, right? If you have access to a repo, you basically get read and write access to all the files in that repo. Whereas with our solution, we can be pretty granular about who can access what. And that's important, but it's not the first thing you have to do. The first thing I think it's probably best is just to leave things where they are and then allow us to passively start creating the data model and taking snapshots. The other thing is it can become compelling for developers to start using our platform, even if you're loading the config changes from Git. They'll see immediate value if they start using ServiceNow to actually make changes to the config, because they'll get immediate feedback as to whether something fails policy. If something's invalid, they won't have to wait for a Jenkins pipeline to fail if it's invalid. They'll see immediately if something is invalid. It'll show them that when they make that change. Yeah. Okay.
Excellent.
So I think we have one more poll, and I'll go ahead and launch that. And this is about, how prolific infrastructure as code is, right? Would you say you are utilizing infrastructure as code practices today?
It'll be interesting to see what the spread is here, because
people
talk about infrastructure as code a lot, but I'm not sure about how many people actually really doing it properly today. So, okay, fair number of answers. Let's wait a few seconds more for others to add. There's a question here actually about this from somebody as well. If you mean infrastructure as code, do you mean AWS resources?
Yeah, AWS could certainly be defined with code, right? So AWS has CloudFormation built into it, which is considered infrastructure as code. So CloudFormation templates. You could also be using something like Terraform or Kubernetes that actually deploy into AWS, but you define what you're going to deploy. essentially in YAML files, which are using templates and so on.
Yeah, Lewis had another question too, which I think is relevant to do here. So let's tackle this while people are still answering the poll. So he asks, how does CSDM 4.0 relate to this discussion? Since it will introduce the build domain, which it would include some elements, although we're not sure which yet, for SDLC. I think that would include configuration from central repositories if using the DevOps application. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely correct. So what we introduced, I think, in the CSDM 3.0 was the concept of the lifecycle model. And what we've done, and then probably it's a good time to switch over to the demo now, because I'll basically start with this. What we've done is we've linked the config data and the config data model to that SDLC model, right? And that's just going to become more enriched as we move forward with the CSDM. Yeah. So that link is extremely valuable. It basically allows us to use policy in the policy that can reference attributes of that application service. So maybe I have an application that's in the EU. So the attribute's going to say, okay, it's in Frankfurt. And maybe it's going to tell me that it's customer facing. So then I know that I have to apply, GDPR governance to it. And what that means is I have to make sure we're not making changes that will deploy a database outside the EU, for example. That's just one example, right? And so being able to have that information as part of the policy is extremely powerful. Okay,
it's a great example, because that's a difficult thing to do otherwise, I would say.
Yeah, you're relying on attestation.
Right.
Now you're relying on attestation. Somebody basically checks a box saying, yeah, I did this correctly. And what we're doing is we actually have the data to say you did it correctly or you didn't, right? So here is a DevOps pipeline.
Sorry, Joe, just before you go on,
Sure.
we still have the poll showing, so we'll just mention that before we stop it sharing. But yeah, as we'd expect, actually, not a lot of people yet would say they're doing infrastructure as code, about 10%. Of those in the call right now.
Yeah, kind of surprised that so. The plan to numbers are as low as they are. Yeah. I think the plan to numbers would be higher, but this is a group that likes things the way they are, stability. Yeah.
And one more follow-up question here: would that not make changes part mean you have to use the application service as the CI of a change?
You can use the business service as well. So either of those two, I mean, there is some room for customization there. So, but basically we don't want to get any lower than the application service. So business service, application service, that's the model. That's where we want to link the configuration data in the model. Anything lower than that, like the components of an application, that will actually be for infrastructure as code, that would actually be in the config data model because it's more dynamic. You could have 10 of them one day, 5 of them the next. They're going to get destroyed and recreated every time the pipeline runs. So that type of ephemeral environment with immutable infrastructure that gets created every time, that's where our solution is really going to be a good fit. Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. So I think we got this laid out. We set the context here. So what I'm showing you here is a Jenkins pipeline. And what you see is what we've done is we've augmented the pipeline with a parallel branch that as you're validating the application code, what we're doing is we're uploading the config data. Basically, we're finding all the JSON files, the YAML files, the INI files, and then we're validating it, and then we're publishing it as a snapshot, and then we're using that published and validated and trusted config data, secure config data, to actually provision the environment using the exploits, generating the config files to actually provision the environment, right? So if, for example, something were to fail, let's say, in this case, the upload fail or the validation fail, and this is the example that I gave earlier. If we found out that we were provisioning, we did an AWS region check, and we were provisioning out to the US instead of the EU, we can call that out and we can stop the pipeline and we could prevent that change from making its way in production. So as a developer, I would see this in my pipeline and I would realize, this is like a quality gate on the pipeline, not so much that the configuration is wrong, because this would provision just fine and it wouldn't break anything. However, it does break the control. It does break the governance. So if we move over to, if we look back at the pipeline, the first step we do is we upload the data, right? So we build the data model and then we validate it. So let me show you what that looks like inside of the application. So I'm going to show you real quick the config data in Git, because that's where it comes from, right? Changes are made to Git. This is my CloudFormation template. This is where the EU setting has been changed from EU to US, but we didn't allow it to get deployed, right? So this is the actual file. Inside of ServiceNow, it's going to be represented here as a component, okay? So what that means is we load it up as a component, CFT, the CloudFormation template, even though within this component, we have other details like data sources, instances, AWS template information, RDS-DBs, S3 buckets, everything we need to deploy the application, all the data is here inside the CloudFormation template, including those database settings that I had where we made some changes to the region, right? So what I can do now is I can go ahead and make a change, right? If I go ahead and say, okay, let's go ahead and change this to US East instead of EU Central. Yeah, I'm going to commit that change. And then I'm going to kick off another pipeline. We would expect that to be caught. Now, we have two options, right? We have two options. We can fix it and redeploy, is what I did between 623 and 624. I actually fixed it. And I said, okay, let's redeploy it correctly. But the other option we have is to go into, from ServiceNow, from inside when the snapshot is being validated. We can see here in that environment where the snapshot failed, right? I could actually find the actual policy that failed. And there's quite a few policies here. I'm looking at the validation results of a particular snapshot. And I can see that, okay, we're also checking to see that there's no white space in places, making sure the certificates are valid. We're also making sure that they're making connections with HTTPS instead of HTTP. All the URLs must use certificates and SSL protocols, right? So these are the kind of validation checks we're doing. These are policies we give you out of the box, essentially, that do these generic things. You could also create your own policies, right? But when you do get an exception, you do get a failure, I have an option to actually request an exception. So what this does, and this is managed by governance, risk, and control, this will actually go into GRC and create an exception and allow that policy then to continue. But in many ways, it's, so here's the validation. So we provide that information back to the developers. They'll know when something fails, why it failed. They'll actually see it as a test result, right? So this information is provided for them. And then in ServiceNow, in the compliance workspace, if I'm looking at the controls for, let's say, in this case, it's GDPR compliance, right? I can say, hey, show me, what the, let's look at a control objective. I'm going to filter if you're using maintain GDPR compliance, I could actually link those policies to the controls, right? So here we see DevOps config policies actually linked to the control itself. So there's, in this case, the control is executed, in 79 different places, different environments. And every place that runs, we're going to run this policy to make sure that we're not provisioning databases outside of the EU, All right, makes sense. Any questions come up about that? Okay, so one obvious question is, how are these policies written, right? So how are these policies written? Well, the policies themselves are written in JavaScript. Okay, so within ServiceNow, we have an engine for executing policies. It's called the policy as code engine. And this is a new component. It's like a new common service in ServiceNow that could actually be used by other tools, in the future. But right now we're using it in DevOps Config. All the policies we run will basically run a little bit of JavaScript. And this is what it looks like. And you can actually take an existing JavaScript and tweak it to run your own policies. So it's not too difficult to create your own policies, especially since we give you all these examples. Okay. So now that you understand, we have quite a few policies out of the box, right? And I'll show you what they look like here that you can start with. It's easy to get started just by connecting to your pipelines and taking snapshots of the configuration settings. Okay, so now we have snapshots, and snapshots actually become useful because they become part of the change record. So if you saw the previous DevOps change velocity webinar, you'll know that when we get to a production deployment, we'll actually open up a change record, right? And what that means is we can see, let me go to show you what that change record looks like. We can see all of the DevOps data that came from the pipeline, all the commits, all the work items, all of the various testing that was done in the pipeline. And if I look at one of these, for example, I also see whether the config data is validated. So now we have a checklist of policies, and we use the change approval policies here, right, to actually check to see that operational stability looks good, everything looks good, and we can automatically approve this change based on that. So we actually link the change, the config change I just made, the snapshot of the config data I just made to that change request, and we see if it passed validation or not. And if it passes validation, that becomes one of the items on the long list of items that get fed into the change approval policies, so we could automatically approve this, right? So auto approval is a big part of being able to govern DevOps changes without slowing down the pipeline, but without giving up all the different rules that you have in place before something goes into production, okay? And the DevOps config data is part of that check. Now, the other thing I wanted to show you is that once we have it in place, once we have these snapshots in place, we can now use it as insights in an alert, right? So basically, when an alert comes in, an incident comes in, in this case, I get an incident, and I'm doing incident management now. The alert comes in, I can see no payments processed for the last 15 minutes. One of the things we provide with the service operations workspace is possible root causes. And what that means is we're going to give you a list of all the changes that took place in the past, let's say 2 weeks or so. Like what change caused this problem? And based on, a little bit of a little AI in there and some algorithms, they're determining, they have a scoring system of which change most likely led to this alert, right? And if we look at the change request itself in service operations workspace, I can see the actual config changes. So first, I can see the actual config data model that shows up here. So I can go into the actual snapshot and see all the data and all the settings for that particular. Maybe I'm looking for a specific setting. Maybe I have some awareness as to what could have possibly caused this issue, and I can see the actual values. But more than likely, you're just going to want to show me everything that changed from the previous snapshot, right? And what we could do is we don't have to go back to the previous snapshot. Let's say it's a performance degradation issue. I can say, show me what started when performance started degrading 2 weeks ago. Show me that snapshot and compare it to the one today. And let's see specifically only the things that changed. And I see, okay, a firewall rule changed here, right? And that firewall rule could have impacted the performance of the application. So I could drill down to a specific change from any of the snapshots that take place. If I want to go back 2 weeks, I can see that there were some snapshots taken here on the timeline, some snapshots taken here, and all of this happened just before the alert came in. So being able to drill down to specific changes while I'm troubleshooting an incident, actual key value pair changes, right, is extremely valuable, because this is something that you kind of lose in the DevOps world. You lose this visibility, you lose this transparency when things are happening on the development side, unless you start taking snapshots and bringing them into ServiceNow. Yeah. All right, how are we doing, Rich? Any questions here?
No new questions. No, I think the audience is stunned at how good that is. It's kind of impressive to see all of that. The ability to go and just find that without having to go and talk to a developer or start digging through code or things like that is I'm impressed every time I see it. But no new questions at this point.
Okay, great. So let me, I just want to show one more thing in the demonstration, and that is back in the DevOps Config workspace here. We talked about the ability to basically use the data that we have in the data model to use it for provisioning environments. And this capability is the exporters. So what that means is you might have some different tools in your environment that you use to provision. Maybe it's Ansible, maybe it's Terraform, maybe it's Chef. So we can generate data, for those tools. We could generate data from the snapshots, right? So the snapshots are normalized data, no longer do we regard the source of the data as the way it's formatted. But what I can do is I can say, okay, let's generate the data in different formats. So that's what I'm going to show you now. This is just a very simple exporter that takes all of the data in a snapshot. Let's say I want the latest snapshot from that production environment. And if I click on evaluate, this will be in a JSON format. It's going to generate the data in JSON, right? So this is something I would use to, to just see what everything in the snapshot looks like. Now, I could also say, give me the same data in a YAML format, right? And then I'll evaluate it and it'll give it to me in YAML format. Now, what that means is the same exact data can be used by different tools, right? Now, usually you wouldn't generate all the data in a snapshot, right? More than likely, what you're going to do is you're going to say, okay, give me all of the data for a specific tool. I like to use Terraform as an example because Terraform is quite common, but it also has a proprietary data format. When you pass data to a Terraform template, you got to pass it in this TF-bars format. Now, TF-bars looks like JSON, but it's not really JSON. It doesn't have commas between the fields. So I could say, okay, give me data for a specific, let's say a database. So I'm going to say, okay, give me MyDB. And let's generate that. Now I'm going to generate it this time in a raw format because I want the exporter here to manipulate the data and generate it in the TF-bars format and now evaluate. And this is the proprietary format. So even if you're using like a homegrown tool and you want the data like in a CSV file, or you want the data, you want to load it into a database, or you want the data in something that's more like just a list of settings, or something that's tab delimited, you can use the exporter to generate the data that way. Now, once you have the exporter in place, you need to then be able to generate this, whatever API you're using, whatever tool you're using, you need to be able to get the data out. So we provide, okay, if you're using ServiceNow, or if you're using a curl command from the command line, a lot of tools just rely on command line and use a curl command. I could generate it in Python, and it'll actually give me the actual code snippet to put in my Python script to make the API call to get the exported file. So this is very powerful and it's very accessible. So now, I have an endpoint that says, this is my trusted validated configuration data, and I have a mechanism to get that data in a secure way and then create the file. And often I don't need that file to exist anywhere. So if I start up my microservice, like a Spring Boot server, I can then delete that file as part of the startup procedure. And then I no longer will have sensitive data at risk on the file system. It's all secured in ServiceNow. So this is another way we can enhance the security of an environment. Okay? So that is pretty much all I had for DevOps Config. I think we want to give the opportunity for questions.
Yeah, feel free, everybody, to put questions into the Q&A or any other comments you might want to put into the chat. The other thing I was going to mention, Joe, and this might not be clear to everybody before they got on the call, although I think it's publicized in various places, but all this capability that Joe has just showed you as this DevOps config, what we're calling DevOps config, it's a part, as of the Tokyo release, it's a part of ITSM Professional and Enterprise. So if you already have licensing for ITSM Professional or Enterprise, you have this capability, and we'd certainly encourage you to experiment with that, as well as what we would call DevOps change velocity, which is kind of applying the same kind of policies to automating change requests from a DevOps pipeline, really to help your DevOps teams, as Joe said earlier, to keep moving at high speed without having to worry so much about the governance pieces. They never have to log into ServiceNow, create change requests, or worry about configuration policy. We're handling this as a part of their pipeline. And you'd have entitlement to this, again, if you have ITSM Pro or Enterprise already today. I was going to add that as commentary. I don't see any new questions coming in, Joe. I don't know if there's something else you wanted to use to wrap up. But this recording will be available. There is a link in the chat already to go and get that, as well as other resources that you can go and find out more about ITSM Pro and chat in the community with others about what they're doing in ITSM. I really want to say thank you to Joe for putting this together and sharing that in-depth demo. And thank you everyone for joining. Any last comments, Joe?
No, just want to say thank you as well. Thank you, Richard. Thank you for the team here for supporting us. And thank you for everybody that attended.